and the department will present a united front to the outside world. Because we were small, we were weak, we didn't even have equipment. And I literally stole our first equipment, if you'll recall.
May I interrupt at this point? This was,
you stole
by
too?
happenstance, there was a new wing added to Dyke Hall.
Museum.
And I was entitled to occupy the entire wing for anthropological research as curator of the Division of Anthropology.
The 5th floor.
I invited the anthropologists to occupy the offices, and we had to go through the deans to get this over the prone body of the director of the museum, who was a zoologist who didn't know what anthropology was in the first place. And so we were able to make a physical separation, which was we're a unit in a building. We were not scattered down a corridor in another building with sociologists interspersed.
Yeah. So that happened in 1963, and I remember when Bob and I wheeled typewriters and chairs, and we carried desks across the campus and set up for business as a department of anthropology.
Our departmental equipment, and when we moved into 502 Dyke, consisted of 2 tables, not even desks, 2 chairs, 2 typewriters, I believe a filing cabinet. Maybe we shared, I can't recall exactly, but I know we didn't have much to go.
Well, when you left, I'd let you take the Webster's Unabridged Dictionary.
Oh, that was very nice.
Said we knew all the words.
Well, we knew that was there, so we were all set on that. So anyway, that's how we started. Well, then we, year by year, added more people. Let's see, in 1963, by that time, we had moved it along to the point where separation was becoming a very serious question with the administration, and we had meetings.
But we had a fait accompli.
And it was a fait accompli.
And both Bob and I received our degrees in 1963, so finally we were legitimate rather than only aspiring to.
And then we became officially separated as of July 1, 1964. We already Carl had already produced one MA. I don't know, Carl, when you got the MA program started.
It was actually long before. It was 1958 that Maria Willie from Costa Rica got a degree in plains archaeology.
Yeah, when did you start the actual MA?
With zoology. I can't put a date on that. We had an undergraduate major as early as 1950.
Well, it was a Department of Sociology until 1950, and then you got it. I have that announced
the combination
here.
department.
The combination department, right?
We used the guidelines of the combined department, the sociologist, to get her. The number of courses, and that she had to write a thesis.
She finished that the year I came, so I hardly got to know her at all. She was around a little bit.
She's now in the atmosphere of deanship at the University of Costa Rica.
So. Okay, then we began adding people. We became separate. Then as of February 15 of 1964, we were authorized. We had spent a lot of time developing a graduate program, and we were authorized to. We already had the MA program, thanks to Carl. We then constructed, if you'll recall, a PhD program. We already had 2 people in the pipeline for that, our first 2 PhDs. We actually then became officially a PhD granting department as of February 15, 1964. And what is the year? Oh, it was 1967. Each down the hill, Robert B. and Harry Lindquist.
Harry Lindquist, yeah.
Meanwhile, though, we had been producing MAs and many BAs all this time. We had large enrollments, if you'll recall, and we had a fair number of undergraduate major students by this time.
I often joke with people that I started my career teaching in Hoch Auditorium, and I hoped that I won't be finishing my career teaching in Hoch Auditorium.
Yeah.
We had classes at the time. I know Bill Bass had 600 to 800 people.
More than
eventually,
that, Felix.
or
That's
1,000
what I had.
even, 1,000.
Bill he and I alternated. He would take it two semesters. His enrollment, this was in the introductory course, his enrollment, Anthro 1 it was, his introductory would have, well, it went up to 1,100 one time, then 100 and 1,100. Then the third semester, I would take it, and it would plummet down to about 600, 650. Then Bill would come back in. It would go back up again for 2 semesters.
I know. When we began to teach cultural anthropology, which I taught, the enrollment was between 400 and 600 people. Yeah.
We had more people in that one introductory course than we have had in our entire enrollment up until recent years. The late 60s and 70s, our enrollments dropped, or all the social sciences declined.
Yeah. Let's say a few words. I agree with you that Carol Clark, I think, was very instrumental in eventually letting us form our own department. But I feel one of the reasons that anthropology grew as rapidly was the great interest in area studies, and was probably the great dean that the University of Kansas had, certainly in our generation, because he was a visionary and he had a great influence in how the University of Kansas
don't forget Chancellor Murphy, too,
and Chancellor Murphy,
who had been the spark plug behind the thing.
That the international dimensions were always very surprising to me, because here in the Midwest was becoming very rapidly a globally oriented university, and I think that was instrumental in making anthropology what it was and helping us to hire as many people as we did.
There's no question. We were meeting a need, a growing need. There's no question about that.
There was also an interest in working with collections in the museum, and I was able to get some NSF grants to finance graduate students and undergraduates working on collections. But by 1968, I had too big a backlog and turned the museum position over to Alfred Johnson. That is, the position was curator of the Division of Anthropology in the Museum of Natural History. Soon thereafter, we were able to get I must say that I've never received any credit formally or informally for my 21 years that went into building up those collections that you can now look at.
I think that the first encounter you had with Al Johnson was that
I hired him at the age of 15, and he turned 16 in the field in South Dakota working for me on it.
So obviously he had long going back to association.
To 1951.
I see. If I may, let's turn a little bit to some of the topics that we among ourselves discussed earlier, and a few words about the academic climate of the 1960s, because we are always surprised to hear that anthropology at one time had, I believe, 17 positions or even 18. I mean, we had more positions certainly than we had now, and I think that this is part of the academic climate of the 1960s, when everything was going roof and everything
was growing. When I retired in 1980, my position was not filled again.
Yeah.
We had a total of 18 people by in the 1968-69 year. So we had built up from half-time position to that in 10 years to 18 people, which was...
what about some of the changes in physical anthropology that occurred? People going to other schools and other people coming in.
Yeah, some of that happened because a good part of that transition, but our earlier physical anthropology was the more traditional kind of physical anthropology, with great stress upon osteology and I suppose you could call
archaeological collection and
development, this sort of thing, rather than genetic anthropology, genetic physical anthropology. That occurred. Well, we had, for instance, we had Bill Bass, and we brought, if you remember, we brought Ellis Curley, who was a little more oriented toward genetic anthropology, but he was still in the traditional mold. And then Tom McKern, who came and added a tremendous strength to us in that field. As a matter of fact, then, we were the outstanding physical anthropology in the entire plains or central United States region.
As a kind of a footnote, I should add that I was trained in physical anthropology at the University of Washington, as many of our generation really were, that we anthropology really subsequently to our first training in physical anthropology.
See, I trained under Theodore McCown at Berkeley, who was a physical anthropologist, and I had actually a more graduate study in physical anthropology, I don't know if I've ever told you this, than I did in archaeology. Although I did an awful lot of field work in archaeology, I did an awful lot of laboratory work in physical anthropology.
And of course, my professor eventually went to Arizona, and Fred Holtz.
Right.
I was the TA of Fred Holtz for something like 4 or 5 years, and I remember that at that time there was no question of having limits to how long you could stick around as a graduate student.
Well, I had to have strong emphasis in field in anthropology, and my physical under Harry Shapiro, who was best known outside of physical, his book Heritage of the Bounty. He studied the descendants of the bounty mutineers. And during the war, I had constant association with von Königswald and Weidenreich with the casts of the Zhoukoutian fossils. These were all being at the American Museum, and I assure you, they didn't have any originals.
Yeah. Let me add that I think part of the 1960s, and maybe the interesting aspect in forming the department at Kansas, was that our generation, at least the 3 of us, really were the second generation in American anthropology. I know one of my professors was Erna Gunter, who was the director of the museum at the University of Washington, and also the senior faculty member, and she was a student of Boas, and I know that Carl...
That's how I got my start, with students of Boas teaching the courses, Gene Weltfish and Alexander Lesser, and then later Ralph Linton and Duncan Strong. Of course, I'm skipping one of the most important ones, Ruth Benedict. And, well, there were, being a place like Columbia in New York City, the big names of anthropology were constantly coming in and out of the offices and visiting New York.
So let me ask you, what happened then to these marvelous years where we expanded very rapidly, and we hired X and Y, and we had to cover many geographical areas? What happened from the 1960s? Because we tried to cover all the sub-disciplines and develop very carefully that we had enough resources for all the sub-disciplines. We tried very hard to make it into a department that really reflected American anthropological tradition of the time, which was not bad. We had the support by the administration, because they were the Department of Anthropology. What happened to us? I mean, did the 1960s evaporate? And
I was chairman, I was the first chairman of the department in 1960. Well, I was called associate chair for anthropology for 2 years, 62 and 63, and then I became, as we became an independent department in 1964, I became the official chairman of our department.
And I became the associate to you.
Right. So we struggled along with me as chairman until I resigned the chairmanship in May of 1968, and by that time we had accumulated 2 linguists, Dale Kincaid and what's his name, Dale Nicholas, which we had, in other words, we had a well-rounded department in all of the 4 major fields of anthropology. Our ultimate goal, if you'll recall those discussions, was to get to a maximum of 21 faculty members. We thought that that was the ideal size. We never quite made it, but things then began to happen. The 1960s were first very idealistic in terms of social anthropology, or well, social studies, I should say, the social sciences. then toward the end of it, there set in this period, I think, of disillusion, which reflected into the social sciences, and I think that was the beginning of the decline of the social sciences that it went on through into the 1970s. You may not agree that this is the way it happened, but I think there was a disillusionment because there was all these bright hopes, like burning down the Union and a few things, and bombing our computer center and a few things to get the
I think
points
as
across.
a footnote, we should say that the Union, of course, was burned partially, and that the furniture was piled in front of it, and that 3 people got killed on Jayhawk Boulevard and by the library. And that building, I still recall that for about a week I had to spend my nights in Fraser Hall because each one of us was assigned to a floor together. I remember I was assigned with Maynard Shelley to see that the students did not storm Fraser Hall and took away all of our precious memos that we had written to we would be.
Where you're starting terrorism?
We never had protest directed to us. In fact, we anticipated some of the needs of students at that time and instituted the departmental meeting in which student representatives were present.
We probably were the first department on the campus of the University of Kansas to deliberately incorporate students into our official departmental structure. If you'll recall, I think, the rule now is there should be 20% representation. We had, I think, something approaching 40%, both undergraduate and graduate. We used to have those large so-called departmental meetings, which were distinguished from our faculty meetings, which had to do with budget and this sort of thing.
It was absolutely necessary to have confidential meetings.
Of course.
Because the administration demanded it.
All policy shared in by students, and they still are, except we aren't making many policies just now. But I think what this did, of course, was disarm all of this violence. I was in Mexico, so I missed the burning of the Union, the bombing of the computer center, the killings on Jayhawk Boulevard. I missed all that. I read about it in Mexican
I was in
newspapers.
Asia, and I had some of the burnings firsthand, but certainly when I returned to the campus, I was told that the war in Vietnam had reached Lawrence, Kansas as well. And for me, the explanation of the changed climate really is that at one time the Department of Anthropology had a lot of money. I remember Project Themis, which probably caused one of our earliest vision among ourselves, was a project of more than $1 million. We had one student in Pacific. We had essentially, some have suggested, more money than we knew what to do, and therefore there were other members in the university and in the faculty of the anthropology department who didn't look very kindly at some largesse that went to part of anthropology but not the whole department. And I think for me the explanation of how the 1960s influenced the department was that the division in the country was reflected, and we should not expect anything else, was reflected in our department.
Oh, certainly.
That the politics changed.
The climate had changed. Federal funding. I could see that even as early as 1968, that there was a shifting, and I had a good deal to do with it for a time, had begun to taper off on social science, in the social science granting, and to direct it more toward the applied sciences, the hard sciences, so-called. And so we were just part of a larger trend of things.
I want to bring in a little bit, we should talk for a minute or so, that the relationship between the museum and the department obviously was initially a very close one, because Carl, you began essentially a department by having move the department to the museum. That is very different in the 1980s, obviously.
Oh, yes. Well, well, first of all, the chairmanship of the department and the directorship of the museum are two positions on equal footing, both responsible to the administration. The department does not have any control over the museum other than control over students who are doing research for credit in the museum. It does not direct the museum director. And the people who have joint appointments to, and there in teaching the course, they are responsible to the department, but not for their research in the museum.
Yeah, that wasn't always that way. Yeah. When we first started, of course, the museum was really part of the department. That is, you were regarded as part of the department.
But I never accepted that.
Well, you see, you were not independent, though. That is, there was not an independent museum of anthropology. It was part of the Museum of Natural History.
I was the division of anthropology in the museum.
And then when Al Johnson took over the directorship, he was...
Well, then there was a separation.
Changed. Right.
And then the director became the ranking equivalent of chairman of
Not right away, about 3 years. Mm-hmm. And he agitated for that, and finally we acquiesced, if you'll recall, in the separation of the museum that would then be under the graduate school, and the department, of course, would be with the genesis right there of the separation.
See, I think that part of the early making of the department was really based on the idea that the three of us, and certainly there were a couple of others in the early 1960s, but the ideology and the kind of vision that we had of the department was the very best people for the areas that we felt should be covered. Mm. And we were interested in building a overall quality department of anthropology with an extent into 3 area programs that existed at the University of Kansas. The area programs were Latin American Studies, East Asian Studies, and Soviet and Russian Studies, as you recall. The last few minutes of this discussion to maybe reminisce, and if you have any suggestions, where did we go wrong? In other words, since this program is going to be part of a history of I hope we discussed many things that we did right, but what did we do wrong in retrospect? Because we did not reach a goal of 21 people. We are now a department that reflects the bureaucracy really of the university, which has grown more complex and complicated. What did we do wrong?
It's awfully hard to say, Felix. One thing that we did do is precisely what you said. Our goal was to select the best people that we could find to fill the positions we created. We never considered the personality of the candidates to be irrelevant. The thing was they were to be competent, talented people, fully capable of managing their little world. Now, we created those worlds. We thought that that was the best way to build. Actually, at the very beginning, it probably was true, but later on, perhaps we should have gotten a little more smart. Emil Haury, for many, many years, was the chairman at the head, they call him, at the University of Arizona. I had a long conversation. Now, he was born in Kansas. He's always had a strong interest in the University of Kansas. He's kept very abreast of our departmental history. So I met with him, I've been going out there every year for years, and I met with him 2 years ago at Bill Steeney's house. Bill, by the way, was one of our faculty members for several years with us, a physical anthropologist, and is now head of the department at Arizona. At any rate, Emil told me that the mistake we made was, as we got larger, was not in paying attention to the way that the faculty member would fit in with the other faculty members. And he said one of their criteria that they established years and years ago was they looked very closely at the personality of the person, and they developed a technology of determining whether or not that person could interact, could function well within the group as they wished the group to function.
No, that's the answer. Yeah. That's the trouble.
So maybe we could end this initial attempt to establish a kind of a video record of our intentions were able, our intents were sincere, but we did have human weaknesses, and maybe we didn't pay enough attention. Essentially, we still have to interact with each other as human beings, and not just as professionals.
I think, in fairness, we ought to make something quite clear. I think we've had some bad luck. In general, I think this 14th year as chairman, believe it or not, has had a remarkably good relationship among ourselves. All one needs to do is meetings to realize that, with one or two exceptions, and I won't name those exceptions, the department functions very well as a group. We have, as the disciplines have developed themselves a little bit further from one another, had to suffer that. Yes, we've become more remote from one another, but when there's something crucially important, we come back together again, and I've seen it so many times. It's been the redeeming thing, I think, that I'm going to take with me when I leave here, that this was a good department when I left it, and I think it still is a good department, and I don't think the future is dark at all. I think the future is bright, but we'll see.
The future will tell. We tried, and as I have often said, if I die on my gravestone, I would like to have written, "He tried." So thanks very much for coming here, and hopefully this is the beginning of some kind of a video history and video documentation of the department. Thank you.
And always wanted to go to Easter Island. So it was like a graduate seminar. Sure, some of them were what we called at Columbia culture vultures, but many of them were well-educated people, MDs and professors and so on, who always wanted to know more about Easter Island. And that expanded to South America and to Egypt, so that I even got to Africa on the strength of my having attended a seminar here at KU with Raymond Dart on the Australopithecine back in the 1950s. So I gave lectures on his contributions and the contributions of Leakey, actually on the scene, or at least on the water by the scene from Cape Town to Mombasa. And
we always believed that we should be away. I know that Bob Squire started once a rumor that Morse was not really a real person, that he only existed on paper because I was never here.
You'd be calling our man in Korea.
I just think that anthropology should stay a discipline where you spend really a considerable period of your professional life in the field, because if the discipline is going to continue to prosper, that's what we have to do.
You've got to see different societies on the hoof, not read about them in books.
That's right.
And one year, I went 180 degrees of longitude in a matter of a couple of months. I went from Tahiti to Moscow.
Well, not all of us are quite that lucky, but I suppose the real crunch will come for the department in the 1990s, when some of the things that we are talking about in the dark ages I think it's important that people remember their own history, otherwise they are condemned to relive it.
I still haven't gone around the world like you. Remember I called you the Weltumsegler.
We've left out, you know, one thing that occurs to me, we've left out giving the names and credits to a number of other good people we've had with us.
Why don't you do that?
Some of whom are still here. Well, I said we had 18 people, and we've had several people. I have a list here of some of the people who were here. Charles Valentine was here with me for just 2 years, and he got a Mellon Fellowship, and he went to, and never came back. He went to University of Pittsburgh. He was replaced by John Cole, and a couple of years, or 3 or 4 years later, Bill Stein came from Cornell, and then Millie Dykeman came, if you recall, from University of California. Keith Otterbein came from Pittsburgh. Those are some of the people we've had here. And we've had several others, John Jeffroy, if you'll recall, Charles Adams. These are some of the people who have been here and are gone, but look at the number who we haven't even mentioned who are still here. James Clifton was here. He's gone now. But Alan Hansen, Robert Hinshaw, Ellis Curley I did mention, and McKern. Kincaid, of course, was with us for several years. And I haven't mentioned Robert J. Smith, who's been very important in our department for many years. Antamonte White, still with us. We had Dorothy Wilner. She came in 1966 and is still with us. We had Rosalie Wax for a number of years.
Henry Lunsgaard.
Henry Lunsgaard. So there have been a number of people, some of whom are still here, some of whom have been here and are gone. So we've had I suppose, the normal turnover. But I think they've all had a role in the development of anthropology at KU. Are we running